I think the funniest thing about Love is War is that almost every major conflict could have been solved by one normal conversation. Kaguya likes Miyuki, Miyuki likes Kaguya. Both of them probably know something is happening, and instead of admitting any of it, they build psychological traps around who speaks first, who texts first, who accidentally reveals too much, or who can make the other person look more interested. That shouldn't be enough to carry an entire romance comedy, because once you understand the joke, you should technically understand most of the series, but somehow I never got tired of watching them do it. A completely ordinary interaction could suddenly have strategies, counter-strategies, internal monologues, and a narrator, describing everything with the seriousness of an actual war, while the prize was sometimes something as small as getting the other person to ask a question first. The contrast made it work for me, because both Kaguya and Miyuki are supposed to be incredibly capable people. They're smart, competitive, respected by almost everyone around them, and they can deal with situations that would make most students uncomfortable. Then romance enters the room, and suddenly, two of the smartest people in the school are wasting an absurd amount of brain power trying to avoid looking slightly embarrassed. I think that's where the premise stopped feeling like a gimmick and started feeling strangely believable. Obviously, most people aren't creating elaborate psychological operations because somebody hasn't replied to a message yet. But that basic instinct underneath it feels familiar. When you care too much about what one person thinks of you, tiny things suddenly start feeling much bigger than they actually are. The show understood how funny that could be, especially when neither of them wanted to surrender even a little bit of pride. Sharing an umbrella wasn't just sharing an umbrella. Messaging somebody wasn't just messaging somebody. Sitting slightly closer could become evidence in a case that only existed inside their heads. And every small victory somehow felt important because both of them treated it like it was. I probably wouldn't have enjoyed the series nearly as much if the joke was simply that these two were too shy to confess. They weren't passive about it at all. They were constantly doing things. They were just doing almost everything except the obvious thing, which made watching them fail feel much more entertaining than watching another couple misunderstand each other for 20 episodes. The part that became more relatable to me wasn't really the idea of refusing to make the first move because of pride. It was how quickly both of them could overthink something that probably didn't deserve that much think. One small change in tone could become suspicious, a delayed response could suddenly mean something, and a completely normal situation could turn into 5 different possible outcomes before anyone had actually done anything. That's exaggerated for comedy, but the feeling underneath it isn't that exaggerated. Sometimes you want to seem completely normal around somebody, while your brain is doing the exact opposite. You're trying to speak naturally, you're trying not to react too strongly, and meanwhile, you're monitoring yourself so much that you're probably acting less naturally than you would have if you hadn't thought about it at all. Kaguya is especially funny in those moments because she can go from looking completely composed to internally collapsing almost instantly. From the outside, there might barely be anything happening, but inside her head, there can be panic, calculations, and damage control happening at the same time. And the show treats that difference between appearance and reality as part of the joke. Miyuki does the same thing in a different way. He wants to maintain this image of someone competent and dependable, so even something small can become dangerous if he thinks it might expose a weakness. And that made some of his funniest moments work, because the audience already knows how much effort is hidden behind the version of himself everybody else sees. That's probably also why Ishigami worked so well for me as a contrast. Kaguya and Miyuki are trying desperately to preserve dignity, while Ishigami sometimes feels like the person standing nearby who can already see how ridiculous everyone is being, then somehow gets dragged into the situation anyway, and regrets being there almost immediately. His social awkwardness also made him feel more grounded than he first appeared. He could be cynical, uncomfortable, and incredibly bad at reading the room in exactly the wrong moment. But there was something recognizable about wanting to avoid certain social situations entirely, rather than pretending you're suddenly good at them. That combination gave the show a kind of comedy I really liked, because I wasn't only laughing at characters acting stupid. Sometimes, I was laughing because the stupid thought process made a little too much sense. A show built around one romantic mind game could have become repetitive very quickly. So, I think a huge part of why Love is War stayed funny was how many different people could completely change the energy of a scene. The premise stayed the same, but the person entering the room could turn it into an entirely different kind of disaster. The narrator is probably one of the biggest reasons those scenes feel so distinctive. He doesn't just explain what's happening. He elevates something painfully trivial into an event that sounds like it belongs in a history documentary. And that commitment makes the joke much funnier, because nobody inside the scene seems aware of how disproportionate the presentation is. Then you have Ishigami, who can make a scene funny just by reacting to it. Sometimes he's the only person who seems aware that something's going wrong. Sometimes he says exactly the thing he probably shouldn't say, and sometimes his entire survival strategy seems to be leaving the room before another human interaction damages him permanently. Chika creates almost the opposite kind of comedy. She doesn't need to understand the battle to destroy it. She can walk into some carefully planned situation and accidentally remove the entire premise within seconds, which makes her feel like a random event neither Kaguya nor Miyuki can ever properly prepare for. Her training sessions with Miyuki became some of my favorite examples of that dynamic, because they start with a normal problem and slowly become psychological punishment for Chika. She tries to teach him something, discovers that he's much worse than expected, somehow takes personal responsibility for fixing him, and by the end, she looks like she's survived an experience she'll never fully recover from. The fact that they kept returning to that joke made it even better because you knew what was coming. The second Chika realized Miyuki needed help with something again, there was this immediate feeling of, oh no, she knows exactly what this means now. Even something as ridiculous as the rap episode works, because by that point, the series has already convinced you that it can commit completely to a stupid idea. It doesn't half play the joke and move on. It keeps escalating until something that should have been a small gag becomes an entire production, and somehow it still feels consistent with everything around it. That's probably what I mean when I say the comedy was just as important to me as the romance. I wasn't sitting through the funny parts waiting for the relationship to progress. The funny parts were already one of the main reasons I cared about spending time with these characters. Ishigami is probably the clearest example of how Love is War could take someone who seemed designed for punchlines and quietly turn him into a character I genuinely cared about. For a while, a lot of his identity is built around being pessimistic, awkward, and slightly terrified of the people around him, which makes it easy to assume that's all he's going to be. Then the sports festival gives him enough context to completely change how some of his earlier behavior feels. Suddenly, the guy hiding behind a screen or trying to disappear from social situations isn't just being antisocial for a joke. There's history behind why he expects people to misunderstand him, and why withdrawing became easier than defending himself every time. I liked that the series didn't erase his awkwardness after giving him that backstory. He doesn't become a completely different person because the audience now understands him. He stays strange, insecure, and occasionally terrible at social interaction. He just becomes a person instead of a type. That mattered because the supporting cast never felt like they existed only to push Kaguya and Miyuki toward each other. Chika could take over an episode through sheer chaos. Ichigami could suddenly carry something emotional, and Miko could enter a room. misunderstand half of what she saw, and create a completely new dynamic without the main romance needing to disappear. The student council room benefited from that more than almost any other location in the series. You could put the same characters in the same room again and again, but depending on who was annoyed, who was hiding something, or who walked in at the wrong moment, the scene could become a game, an argument, a misunderstanding, or another completely unnecessary psychological war. I think that's one reason the world of the anime felt larger than the actual premise. I cared about the central relationship, but I also enjoyed simply watching these people spend time together, which is important for a comedy, because eventually, the plot itself can't be the only reason you want another episode. And once you care about the group, even tiny changes start feeling meaningful. Someone becoming slightly more comfortable around someone else, an awkward friendship slowly forming, or a character who normally keeps people away allowing themselves to participate. Those things don't need a huge dramatic speech because you've already spent enough time with them to notice. The moment I think about when I remember the softer side of Love is War is Kaguya breaking her phone. On paper, losing a phone isn't exactly the kind of event that should become one of the more emotional memories from a romance comedy. But the scene works because the phone isn't really what matters. What matters are the pictures and the little pieces of normal life attached to it. Kaguya has spent so much of her life isolated by her family and by the environment she grew up in. So seeing her care that much about ordinary memories with ordinary friends makes the loss feel bigger than the object itself. Then the series gives her something new, instead of simply replacing what she lost. The people around her still have the photos, the memories still exist, and there's something almost embarrassingly simple about how meaningful that is for someone who didn't grow up with much normal closeness. The fireworks episode hits me for a similar reason. Kaguya wants something incredibly ordinary. She just wants to experience the festival and see the fireworks with everybody else. But her circumstances turn even that into something difficult. And for once, the barrier isn't one of her ridiculous mind games. When Miyuki goes looking for her, the usual competition between them almost stops mattering. He's not trying to win a psychological battle or force her into revealing something first. He's trying to make sure she gets to be there, and that shift is what gives the scene so much weight. I also like that the emotional payoff doesn't suddenly remove the comedy from the characters. They can have a genuinely beautiful moment and then still be embarrassed, confused, or incapable of behaving normally afterward, because being sincere once doesn't magically cure everything that made them awkward in the first place. That balance is difficult to get right. If the show had treated every emotional scene like a completely different genre, it would have felt manipulative. But because the same insecurities are present in both the jokes and the serious moments, the transition usually feels natural. The comedy actually makes those scenes stronger for me. You spend so much time watching these characters desperately hide what they feel that when one of them finally stops hiding for a moment, even something small can land much harder than it would have in a story that was serious all the time. Slow burn romance only works for me when the waiting actually changes something. I can enjoy tension for a long time, but eventually, I need to feel like conversations. Mistakes and small moments are accumulating instead of the story quietly resetting everybody whenever progress becomes inconvenient. Love is War kept giving me that feeling of accumulation. Kaguya and Miyuki don't suddenly become emotionally healthy people, but they learn things about each other. They get closer. Their confidence changes in situations that would have been impossible earlier in the story slowly become possible. That's why the culture festival feels so satisfying. By that point, all the stupid battles over tiny gestures have built up enough history that a bigger romantic move doesn't feel like the story randomly deciding it's time for something dramatic. It feels like these two have finally reached a point where the old rules can't contain what they're feeling anymore. The clock tower and the hearts are completely over the top, which is exactly how I wanted the payoff to look. After watching a series turn shared umbrellas and text messages into military campaigns, of course, the big romantic moment shouldn't suddenly become understated and normal. What I like even more is that getting closer doesn't instantly solve their insecurities. There's still fear, uncertainty, and the problem of showing someone a version of yourself that isn't perfectly controlled, and that gives the relationship somewhere to go after the obvious romantic milestone. That matters especially for Miyuki, because so much of his identity is tied to effort and the image of being good enough. The more Kaguya matters to him, the more frightening it becomes to imagine her seeing the parts of himself he doesn't respect. So the romance isn't only about whether he can confess, it's also about whether he can eventually stop performing perfection around someone he loves. Kaguya has her own version of that problem. She wants closeness, but she spent so much time learning to protect herself that genuinely receiving affection can be almost as difficult as asking for it. And I think that's part of why their chemistry stays interesting after the initial mind game premise starts changing. The payoff works because the series doesn't reveal that the war was meaningless. The war was basically how these two learned to approach each other, painfully and inefficiently, until they could finally do things that would have terrified them at the beginning. When I call Love is War peak romance comedy, I don't really mean that I sat down and compared every joke, every couple, and every dramatic scene against every other anime I've watched. It's more that very few rom-coms gave me this feeling that both halves of the genre were carrying the show at the same time. I didn't have to tolerate the comedy to reach the romance, and I didn't have to tolerate the romance to get back to the jokes. Watching Kaguya and Miyuki completely fail at behaving like normal people made me care about them more. Then, caring about them made every new failure funnier, because I understood exactly what they were trying so hard to hide. The supporting cast mattered for the same reason. Shigami could be painfully relatable one moment and completely ridiculous the next. Chika could destroy an entire plan simply by existing near it. And somehow none of that made the emotional side feel less genuine when the series decided to slow down. I think the scenes I remember best show that balance. I remember the psychological battles and the narrator treating nonsense like history. But I also remember Kaguya staring at a broken phone, the rush to see the fireworks, and the feeling of finally watching years of romantic hesitation produce an actual payoff. Maybe that's the part I miss most about watching it for the first time. Not knowing whether the next episode was going to make me at these characters feel bad for them, or somehow do both within a few minutes. And after all the plans, all the overthinking, and all the attempts to avoid being the person who cared more, the funniest thing is that the answer was always sitting there from the beginning. They liked each other. Everybody watching knew they liked each other. And they still needed an entire war to figure out what to do with that.